1950s. Portland Area Historical Society is charged with preserving the history of the area. For today's event, Historical Society committee members have selected 4 outstanding citizens from Portland's past, researched their lives and what they contributed to Portland's history. Then we present this history in a first-person monologue at the gravesite. This year we are fortunate to have our characters portrayed by students from the Portland Public Schools. We had one cancel out this morning, so we're replacing him with an older student of Portland Public Schools. But our presenters today are Richard Hahn as Dr. Allen, Preston Dibian as Dr. Alton, Josephine Plasek as Mary Newman-Rice, and Elizabeth Pung as Sarah Perrin.
Correction, it's Emerson is playing Dr. Allen. Preston's the one that's second. Sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry. That's okay.
I was given the wrong presenter to cross out. It was not my fault, I know.
Trust these illiterate trappers.
So here's how the event works. We're going to divide into 4 separate groups. And you have your guides back there, numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. Make it as even as you can. And your guide will take you to the first presentation. When you get settled, we'll blow an air horn. There will be 10 minutes for the presentation and whatever conversation you have. We'll wait a few minutes while you regroup. We'll allow 5 minutes to travel in between graves. Our longest trek is probably 3 minutes from the farthest one over to this corner. But we'll allow 5 minutes. We'll blow the horn again, and you'll receive the next presentation. So the idea is here to get all 4 presentations. So if you get mixed up, just make sure you go to one that you haven't been before. We're having a little trouble getting that straightened out ourselves. Today we have cider and donuts for your enjoyment, and they're provided by the Historical Society. Donation is appreciated. We have memorabilia, the historical memorabilia. And we also have here on the cart a Michigan History magazine. It's complimentary of the Michigan History Association, which Portland is part of that. One of the perks of being a member of the Portland Area Historical Society is that this gives you access to the internet programs that the Michigan Historical Society has available to you. So there's one program there called the History Hounds. I particularly enjoy that. I'm going to give you an example. They had a 45-minute presentation on the CCC camps, and then you submit your questions, 15 minutes for questions and answers, but it's a real good program and a real good perk to belong to the Portland Area Historical Society. I have to thank a few people here. Our core committee, the Historical Society is small, but our core committee, Shelley Perry did the programs and the acknowledgments of our presenters today. Margaret Sheffer is a past president, and she helped a lot writing in monologues for the characters. And then Gail Bantle was our trapper here, was the organizer and the worrier of all the things coming together. So we're ready to get started. There are your guides back. Are you ready? All right. Here's your guides back there, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then split it up. They have programs. And I'd like to thank the civic players because they help us put these costumes together. So proceed to your groups, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Split it up as easy as you can. They have programs with them. And support the Historical Society.
You're here.
Well, one last thing. If it rains real hard, we'll blast the horn.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. I have to admit, it's been a while since I've been able to talk to anyone. Oh, where are my manners? Let me introduce myself. My name is Sarah Perrin, and my family was one of the first families to settle in Portland. I think I should start my story where all stories begin, at the beginning. I was born on October 28th, 1793, as Sarah Bennett. My parents, Samuel and Pauline Bennett, lived in Connecticut. Sadly, there came a time when we had to leave Connecticut behind. It just became too expensive to live there anymore. So instead, my parents moved us to a small town in New York called Parrington, near Lake Erie. It was a farming community, so my father fit in well. But my father wasn't always a farmer, you see. During the Revolution, my father served in the Continental Army, though not for very long. You see, he joined in June of 1776, but he was captured after the battle at Fort Washington.
Just speak really loud.
Just turn it off.
Fort Washington.
Battle at Fort Washington, November that same year. He and the rest of his garrison were marched from the battle site to New York, where they were held originally on the prison ship Grosvenor, before being transferred to a British prison, or a sugar house. The conditions in both the prison ship and the prison itself were absolutely terrible. They were given nothing to combat the cold, and in the summer months, ventilation was expressly forbidden. Disease spread through their ranks like wildfire. Out of the 500 men in my father's garrison, only 18 survived, my father among them. Though he did not escape unscathed. By the end of the war, he'd lost all of his toes, and one of his legs was shorter than the other. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. Though my father, he was able to move forward. He always did what was best for our family. That's why he moved us to Parrington. And thanks to his service and the service of many like him, this country has gained and held its freedom. And also thanks to his service, the Daughters of the American Revolution placed this plaque on my grave. My father wasn't the only member of my family to serve in the aid of this country. My husband, Ezra Perrin, served in the War of 1812, though, again, not for very long. Soon after he joined, he contracted the measles and was sent home. We were married in 1813, and in 1815, only a month after the War of 1812 had ended, our first child, Clarissa, was born. 3 other children followed her. William in 1821, Edward in 1825, and Helen in 1827. We spent a majority of our children's early lives in Parrington, but soon prices began to rise again. We became one of the many families moving westward at the time, though unlike a majority of them, we did not take the Erie Canal. Instead, we chose to travel the entire way by covered wagon. The journey was long and arduous. The wagon itself was pulled by a team of oxen, so our pace was slow but steady. In the wagon itself were all of our meager possessions, but even with just that, there was barely enough room for someone to sit inside. So a majority of the time, we had to walk beside the wagon. It took us 7 long days to reach our destination, only stopping when night finally fell. We often slept close together to combat the chill of those early summer nights, and a gun was never far away. You never knew what was going to come out of those woods at night. Honestly, the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced was that journey. We weren't far from New York, and yet everything was different. The land was wild and untamed. Settlements were few and far between, and for a majority of the time, we were virtually alone. I was so scared that I never let the children stray far from the wagon. The only thing that kept us going was the idea of having a little place to call our own. Finally, we arrived. We made our home on the bank of the Grand River. In terms of the town today, I believe it is located where the library is now. Ezra made our little home out of logs, which he had cut down, and canvas from the wagon for the roof and door. It was barely complete by the time winter arrived. The winter of 1834 was the worst winter I've ever experienced. It was so cold. The heat from our fire, it didn't stay in the house. It kept coming out of the door, so it was constantly freezing. I spent a lot of that winter wondering whether we would survive or not, but we did. Otherwise, I'd be telling a very different story. In those early days, there were only a few scattered families living in the township. The town had barely even started coming together yet. There were no stores, no meetings. There was nothing. Nothing at all. Not even a post office. But what was worse than all of that was the lack of provisions. They were very expensive and hard to come by. If you wanted things like bread or pork, you had to travel all the way to Grand Rapids or Detroit. My family, we didn't have the money to do that, so we had to go without. At one point, we spent 3 weeks only eating potatoes. I didn't think I could survive much longer in that way. So I did something I had never done before. I sent everyone away, knelt down, and I prayed to God. I asked him if he would send me some bread. Now, I wasn't a praying woman, nor was I Christian, but I believed there was a God, and I was often angry with him for making my life so hard. And for this reason, when I was handed half a loaf of bread later that same day, I did not give him a second thought. Later in life, after the wooden schoolhouse was erected, we had meetings there, and it was there that I expressed my wish to become Christian. I was one of the very first people to be baptized in the Grand River, one of 3. For the rest of my life, I was a devout Christian, or as well as I could have been. Now, there were many people who were kind and helped. Not just the person who had given me a half loaf of bread. There were also the Indians who lived near where the town now is. They knew all the best places to hunt and fish. They knew the trails in the woods better than any of us. And they knew which plants were good to eat. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have survived those early days. I lived through many things in Portland. Many things. I was here when Philo Vogue opened his store in 1836. I was here when the Newmans came and opened their sawmill. And not just a sawmill either, but they also erected the first bolted flour mill west of Pontiac. I was also here when the post office finally came. There were many, many things that went on in Portland. People just kept coming. Business grew. Eventually, we became our own town in 1869. I was there that day, celebrating with everybody else, looking back on where we had come from. We came from just a few scattered families, and now we were a town in our own right. As we come to the close of my narrative, I thought I would take the time to talk about my family. Sadly, we lost William in 1844 when he was only 22 years old. The next to leave us was my husband Ezra in 1860. I missed him terribly. I could only hope that someday I would see them both in heaven. The rest of my children outlived me. Clarissa, she married a man named John Chipman, and they had 3 children. Edward, he moved to Colorado where he became a miner. He married a woman named Maria Moore, and they had 5 children. Lastly, there was Helen. Both Helen and Clarissa stayed near Portland. Helen married twice, but for now I'll just talk about her second marriage to William Mather. They had 3 children. It was nice to have family around in those early days. The later days of my life. Eventually, I moved from the small house by the river to another house, which I believe was located where the layman's funeral home is now. I died there on November 22nd, 1885. I was 92 years old. There was one more thing I wanted to talk about. You see, Helen's first marriage. In her first marriage, she married a Morin, and they had 1 son, Frederick Morin. He was the first owner of the Orondo, though sadly, I cannot remember his first name. Must be old age getting to me. Thank you all for coming today.
Good afternoon, and welcome. My name is George Duncan Allen. I was born in Orleans, New York on July 11th, 1839. When I was 11 years old, my parents Gardner and Felina Brockway Allen saw, as many people did, the opportunities for farming in the young state of Michigan, and came by way of the Erie Canal to Detroit, and then by river to settle nearby in Hoytville, at what is now the junction of Mulliken Road and Saginaw Highway. There were 4 of us children at the time we made our journey. I, being the oldest, was to see my sister Harriet and brother Spencer, while mother cared for Sarah, who was but 2 years old at the time. My youngest sister Mary was born here in Michigan. In 1850, Portland had its first brick building, but my family was just starting to build a home in what was largely wilderness just a few miles away. Oh, Hoytville had a blacksmith and a tin shop. They had a sawmill, and after the Civil War, they built a Grange Hall. But when the Père Marquette built the railroad just a mile and a half to the north, most of the town's commerce moved to Mulliken. The Grange Hall closed and became a general store for those who remained. By the year 2000, most of what was left of the town was torn down. A lot was expected of an 11-year-old boy back in those days. Why, as soon as you were big enough and strong enough, you did the work of a full-grown man. In my case, I did all I could to help clear land and build shelter for ourselves, tend to our animals, as well as plant and tend to crops. My parents were firm believers in education, and I received mine at the district school. A talented and interested student, I later attended Olivet College. I was a young man by then, ready to start a family of my own. In 1861, I married Phoebe A. Brown, and in 1862, she presented me with our first child, a beautiful baby girl whom we named Hattie. I then went on to the Western Homeopathic College in Cleveland, Ohio, graduating in 1866. Homeopathic medicine was developed in Germany in the 1700s and is not as widely practiced as it once was. But many civilizations had healers who understood that plants, minerals, and even insects had properties that could produce healing effects on the human body. Homeopathic medicine, as you may know, is a doctrine of healing based on similarities. And we homeopathic doctors believe that many diseases are curable by substances which produce effects on the body similar to those of the disease itself. We use small doses of an otherwise harmful substance to assimilate the body and thereby eliminate the otherwise negative effect it would normally have. As an example that is still considered effective, I give you local honey. If a person has seasonal allergies, I would prescribe a daily dose of local honey. The small amounts of pollen taken orally accustoms the body and reduces or eliminates the more violent reaction you might have to, say, a nose full of goldenrod. You may see some of the same familiar substances in my case here as you would in your modern health or natural food shops. Many of my mysterious substances were plant derivatives, such as hydrostasis or golden seal, which is still used for mucous membrane problems such as a runny nose. There was belladonna, ipecac, borax, digitalis, and even coffee. Also, potassium carbonate and bicarbonate powders, which are still used for stomach disorders. And I always carried sugar pills for administering my sometimes bitter compounds. Personally, I believe that many of the common ailments I saw in my daily practice could be attributed to 3 causes: a poor diet, poor elimination, and too tight of corsets. After graduation, I practiced in Jackson, Michigan for a short time with my preceptor, Dr. John E. Smith.
Well, the doctor is beginning, so I guess if you wish, you may begin.
My name is Mary Elizabeth Newman-Rice. I was born on October 23, 1837. I made history by being the first registered white person to be born in Portland. My parents were Rebecca Hickson and James Newman, who arrived here 1 year before I was born. According to my parents, a small tribe of Indians had their home where the Looking Glass River enters the Grand, but they had since moved downriver to where Bogue Flats are. After they moved downriver, a surveyor came and remarked, "Here is good water power. There will be a village here someday." When my parents arrived in 1836, they found a structure that the Indians left. It provided a comfortable shelter for my mom until a house could be built. Philo Bogue was the first to locate here, arriving 4 years earlier than my parents, with his family back in 1833. Mr. Bogue commenced trading with the Indians, who furnished the early settlers with venison, fish, berries, and baskets, all of the best quality, exchanging them for pork, flour, or money. His son William carried on the trading business at the store on the corner of Kent and Bridge Streets. William, or Bill as we called him, did not trade with the Indians. He sold only to the settlers who lived here. My first home was located on the east side of the Grand River. It was constructed of logs and had a bark roof. Split logs furnished the floor in one half of the house, while the bare ground served as the floor on the other half. A hole in the roof let out the smoke until a mud and stick chimney could be built. Blankets served for a time as doors and windows, and this was before the early day of matches, and we took great care not to let the fire go out. I still remember seeing the iron kettles hanging on the crane in the great fireplace. Mother would use the brick oven that was large enough to hold weeks baking for a good-sized family. If I close my eyes, I can still remember the feel of the dough and the smell of the fresh-baked loaves. In the fall of 1836, my maternal grandfather, Abraham Hickson, came to the settlement bringing his wife and 8 of his 12 grandchildren. They occupied the part of the double-log house with my father's family. Shortly after their arrival, the settlers were called together for the purpose of naming the village so that letters might reach them more easily. My father asked my uncle, Abraham Hickson, to go to the village meeting, which he did. When it came into handing in the names, there were so many that it staggered the assembly. The names suggested were Johnstown, Jamestown, Boguetown, Boyerville, and Newmanville. During the silence which followed, Abraham Hickson said to my father, "Why not call it Portland? I think that's a nice name." "Suggest it," said father, but he declined. Father then said that the name Portland had been suggested to him, and he thought it was very appropriate, for there was certainly a fine landing where all passing boats stopped. All present were pleased with the name, and so Portland it was named. My uncle always felt proud that he had suggested the name and kept a warm place in his heart for our village. In the spring of 1837, W.R. Churchill came to the village. He built the structure to be used as a tavern or hotel, as circumstances should direct. First becoming the tavern called the Mansion House, that was run by Joshua Boyer, who was the first postman in that same year. The Mansion House eventually became the location of Crane's Drugstore. Its remained Allen Bank stands on Kent Street. I remember there was an Indian cemetery located in the point of the conflux of Looking Glass and Grand Rivers. My grandfather Elijah Newman had the point fenced in so that the cattle and hogs could not enter the graves. When the Indians discovered what had been done, they kissed his hands as a token of appreciation of the kindness shown. I remember wild games abounding. Wild pigeons were so thick that in the summer that wheat fields suffered from their depreciations. My grandfather, Elijah, was an expert at the game, and I witnessed the springing of many nets in my days. Fish were abundant and of first quality. Sturgeon of immense size was often caught to the delight of a small boy who wanted a piece of sturgeon nose for the center of his ball to make it bounce. Our village shoemaker, William Dismore, who always delighted to please the boys, was kept busy cutting ball covers from old boot tops and instructing mothers how to stitch them. While the rivers were a great resource, the manner of crossing the river before the advent of bridges was varied and sometimes dangerous. There was a flat boat used as a ferry capable of carrying 4 to 5 men and a span of horses. 1 man to do the ferrying and 2 to 3 to hold the horses. The wagon had to go on the second load, and then it was taken over to the team, which was hitched to the wagon and proceeded on its way. I remember watching the ferry cross the river and the anticipation of who was coming and what they were bringing. In 1843, there were 4 stores on Kent Street. Fever and malaria raged through the village in 1846, taking many lives. During the war between the states, over 200 of our local men and boys enlisted and went off to fight. James Harrington built the tavern on the southeast corner of James and Kent Street. As the town grew, we had carpenters, millwrights, farmers, shoemakers, and even a doctor came to town. His name was Moses Beers. A street was even named in his honor, Beers Street. You call it Riverside Drive. Our mail was on the route between Detroit and Grand Rapids, and mail was received once a week by horseback mail carriers. About 1846, stagecoaches took the place of horseback riders, and then there was daily mail. In the early days of the post office, when the mail recipients were little more than nothing, the opening of the mailbag was a ceremony upon which all villagers felt morally obliged to attend. At such times, Mr. Churchill, who was Mr. Bogue's deputy at the time, after he succeeded in the office, would call out the addressees as he could run them over. The eager expendants would step forward and take what was for them. They provided the required 25 cents, which, if I'm being honest, was not always handy. In 1856, I married Napoleon Bonaparte Rice of York State, a school teacher in Portland. N.B., as he was called, was taken into the Newman flouring mill. Our village was blessed with 2 sons, Charles C. and Harlan Elwyn, and 1 daughter. Sadly, my daughter died in 1883. Then my dear husband died in 1912. Then, as if my family had not taken enough sadness, my lovely son Elwyn died in 1919. During the year 1880, 11 brick blocks were erected at the aggregate cost of $75,000. In the early day, the method of obtaining goods by the merchants was to have them brought in by wagon from Detroit, which took 7 to 8 days at first, or until the plank roads was built from Lansing to Detroit. I wonder how long it would take now. No need to wonder. Now, after Elwyn died, I lived 8 more years and died in 1927 at 90 years of old age.
Medical doctors from Portland. I use the W so that people don't get confused with my nephew, Robert A. Alton, who's also a doctor in Portland. I'm here to tell you a little bit about myself. Perhaps you've seen my name around town and heard it in some of the programs from the Historical Society and wondered who that person was. Well, I was born in Lansing in 1854 to Frederick and Mary Alton. My parents settled in Lansing after immigrating from Würzburg, Germany. I was one of 6 children, 4 boys, 2 girls. My father was a cooper. Do any of you know what a cooper is? A cooper made household items such as buckets and butter churns, but also large items such as barrels and casks and horse troughs. I don't think we have any coopers here, do we? Other than in name. But that's where the name Cooper comes from. My mother kept house, as was the custom in the day. I attended the medical department of the University of Michigan and moved to Portland after graduation in 1880 to establish my medical practice. It was shortly after moving that I met Florence Wolcott, the daughter of well-known merchant in town, Chauncey Wolcott. Florence and I were both born in Lansing in 1854. We married at the Wolcott home on October 1880 and led a busy social life. My wife was very popular and interested in many things, including she was belonged to the Ladies' Literary Society, among other things. We were blessed with a daughter, Ethel, in 1881, but much to my sorrow, Florence became very ill. She went to stay with her parents, where she was more comfortable, and died there on January 22nd, 1890. Our entire community of friends went into mourning. Funeral was held at the Wolcott house, where just a few years earlier we had been so happily married. I was fortunate to have Ethel to comfort me, and she would prove to be a blessing my entire life. I know you've been dealing with a pandemic, but did you know that in 1890, the year I lost dear Florence, our world was also dealing with a flu pandemic, which historians seem to have forgotten. People called it la grippe, and sometimes influenza. In January, the Portland Observer noted that there does not seem to be any diminution in the number of la grippe victims in the village. Those who have recovered had their places filled with fresh recruits. Of course, not everyone recovered, and there were many deaths reported as well. And there were about 10 doctors practicing in Portland at the time, and we were kept very busy. In 1899, my older brother Augustus died, and his children, Robert and Maribel, came to stay with us. Robert was an excellent student and followed me into the medical profession. He first set up practice in Westphalia, but then he later came to Portland, and he eventually left Portland for Lansing and became head of the medical staff at St. Lawrence Hospital, and I was very proud of his accomplishment. I was a medical doctor and had a busy practice. And at the time of my death, my peers had elected me the Dean of Ionia County's Medical Men. My medical practice was not the only thing that kept me busy, however. I had many other interests. I belonged to the Masons and was often called upon to speak at public events. In 1896, I had the privilege of being elected village president and served in this capacity for 2 years. Portland had incorporated as a village in 1869, and since that time, it had become a bustling little community. It had several manufacturing plants. Josiah Dilley's plant was shipping out 1,000 to 1,500 railroad carloads of barrel staves a year. Over the years, we had the Tariff Washing Machine Company, the Verity Shirt Factory, and many mills for both grain and lumber. And of course, farming and commerce were important. We had a very busy business district. Duncan Kennedy had a hardware store, and there were the Churchills on the corner of Kent and Bridge. There were millinery shops, one owned by Mrs. Kelland, the mother of the author Clarence Buddington Kelland. But I suppose you don't know what milliners are. Does anybody know what a milliner is? Very good. Hat makers. We also had two banks, Maynard and Allen, and the Weber Bank across from each other. We had pharmacies, one owned by Frank Powers, whose daughter Lynette went on to become a physician in Muskegon, grocery stores, bakeries. Portland was quite a busy little town. In 1899, when my family expanded with the addition of Robert and his sister Maribel, had a wonderful housekeeper, Kate Emery. Kate had a son, Herbert, who was working as a clerk at a clothing store, and Herbert started stepping out, as we say, with Ethel, and they were eventually married. To my great delight, they had two daughters, Florence, whom they named after my late wife, and June. They lived in a house next to mine, and Robert and Maribel moved in with them. I had a little sleeper cottage on the corner of Pleasant and what you call Grand River. In 1960, I was so lame with rheumatism, I was confined to my house for 2 weeks. I eventually checked into the sanitarium in Battle Creek for treatments. I heard that you recently had a successful drive to raise funds for refurbishing Tone Park. A similar drive was conducted in 1925 to raise funds to purchase Dilley's Grove, which was at the top of the hill of what you call Grand River. The Grove was first owned by Josiah Dilley, the barrel stave manufacturer I previously mentioned, who owned the house at the top of the hill. Fred Rowe of Valley City Milling Company, who had recently moved operations here from Grand Rapids, presented a proposal to the Chamber of Commerce, at which time was a very active organization with very many prominent men in the city, that the Grove be converted into a public park. He said he would underwrite half of the purchase price and solicit the rest of the funds from the other members. Mr. Tone, who owned the property, set a price of $1,760. Within days, the funds were for the purchase had been raised. In addition, enough funds were raised to convert and furnish the park. I was a strong supporter, an advocate of the enterprise, helping to raise the funds. My fellow members of the Chamber of Commerce bestowed upon me the great honor of naming the new park after me. The park opened in 1926 as a tourist camp, where people could not only spend a pleasant day picnicking and relaxing, but also camp overnight. The drive was so successful that Frank Powers proposed making a public playground on Water Street. He sold his property to the city for $1 and encouraged other donations, and that is how Powers Park came into being. In 1930, my health was failing, and I entered a hospital in Ann Arbor where I succumbed to pneumonia on November 8th. It was a large funeral with many people attending. Even Governor Green and local businesses were closed during the hours of my funeral. My body was transported to Detroit for cremation, and my remains then were buried here where I'm standing. Thank you.
Oh yeah, everybody, I need your name tags back. Here, I've got another plastic bag here, so I'll put them in a plastic bag.
And then we have